Welcome to Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. An e-zine of the Futures Forum live online. We exchange ideas, information, and inspiration about the futures we want. Get Future Sense Now with host Dr. Claire Nelson, futurist and editor of Human Futures.
And welcome to Future Sense Now, an online magazine of the Futures Forum. We're live online. It is March 2020 and we are celebrating Women's History Month with an exploration into the futures of women. Women 2030 and beyond. Now, UN Sustainable Development Goal number 5 speaks specifically to the development and inclusion of women. In recent years, we've been seeing a rise and upswing in social and political movements, which have gone global. Hashtag Me Too, hashtag Time's Up. So what might we expect in terms of history of our future and the future of women in particular, with consideration to the emerging importance of Industry 4.0 technologies? In this segment, I will speak to Tully, founder of the School of International Futures. She consults, teaches, and advises on emerging strategy and strategic foresight internationally, including at Moscow's Presidential Academy for Public Administration and the United Nations Advisory Group for SDG 16. Previously, she was strategy project director at the United Kingdom's FCO and a policy advisor in the Prime Minister's strategy unit. So I have to hear more about that. Welcome, Tully. How are you?
I am so well. Thank you so much for inviting me, Claire. What a privilege it is to be on your podcast.
Yes, I'm really excited about talking to you, and I'm going to thank you for taking time to run away from Downing Street.
Yeah, I ran away from there about 10 years ago, but yes.
To talk to me. I think it must be very interesting to see how you have dealt with leadership in these very two different capitals. But when you think about the fact that the United Nations is talking about between now and 2030, that's 10 years to go, to end poverty, that's a big task, and hunger, to combat inequalities, to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, to protect human rights, and to promote gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, and finally, and most importantly, to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. How do you view the Sustainable Development Goals, goal number 5, that is talking about gender equality and empowerment of women and girls in this particular frame of the politics of 2020?
Well, let me just say that if what the SDGs are trying to do is to achieve a secure, prosperous, fair, and ecologically balanced world where we're living within our planetary boundaries and where we're trying to ensure that no one is left behind, then focusing on the role of women and girls on that is absolutely critical. Mm-hmm. And let me just take the opportunity, Claire, just to say how glad I am that you're really focusing on this issue, which is the interplay between women, the role of women, the future role of women, and foresight, and the interdependencies between them. Because over the last month, you'll have seen that Blake Morgan came out with the 25 top women in foresight. I have done a piece of work with Tracy Follows, an interview that kind of also explores this issue about, how does a gender perspective to the discipline of foresight enhance the discipline of foresight, and how can we think systematically about the role of women in society in order to create a better and just one? So I think that this topic that we're discussing is integral to the achievement of the SDGs, which is a topic that's close to my heart. But I also think that it's integral to the question of foresight. So what is the endeavor of thinking about the future for, and how do we do it? And in particular, I want to underline the fact that when we're also talking about listening to, and it is an issue around voice and agency and diversity, when we're talking about listening to women's voices, it's also very important to ensure that we listen to the voices of women from different diverse ethnic backgrounds and also different ages as well. So I'm just going to put that front and foremost, that those, given that we're talking about agency and voice and representation, how important it is to also look at the intersectionality of these issues together.
Well, that's very, it's a big, certainly a big reason why I guess I exist. Because one of the things I found when I first got into this professionally, as opposed to just doing it as a side gig at my job, I thought, I tried actually to find space for myself as a Black woman from the Caribbean, working in international development for 30 years in the big four-side houses, and I didn't get a response. I mean, there's just no interest. I'm like, dudes, don't you understand that half of the world looks like me? And my perspective is going to be very important. You really cannot understand everybody's perspective, brilliant though you might be. And it was just not there. And so I said, you know what, maybe I need to just step out and just do something on my own, because if the table is not going to bring up a chair for me, well, I'm going to have to make another table and then invite people to my table and say, because how we share decision making is one of the four big questions we have to ask about how we share our future. We have to consider how we share the planet. We have to consider how we share these human boundaries that we're trying not to go beyond, as you say. We have to consider how we share the rule book. But we have to consider how we share decision making. Who gets a seat at the table? What data gets considered? And so I've been talking a little bit about this idea of creating a smart future, where S stands for sustainable systems, M, meaningful metrics, A, agility and adaptability, R, robust resilience, and T, standing for transformative technology. As you hear this interpretation of the word smart future, what kind of comes up for you bearing the work that you're doing and your own perspective of women's role?
Well, I think if I can pick up on the diversity and the representation in the foresight community piece that you started off with, Claire, which I think is phenomenally important. I agree that there does seem to be a generational gap there, that there is a lack of diverse female voices in this field at a certain age. But I think what's incredibly reassuring for me, we run the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Network and Awards, and that is deliberately aiming to look at the next generation of foresight practitioners as key change agents, in particular from the Global South, but really internationally, and focusing on the under 35s really, although it's anybody that's new to the foresight field.
Yeah.
And so we had 16 special award winners in 2019, and 13 of them were women.
Wow.
And they were from Kazakhstan, India, Australia, Bangladesh, Chile, etc. So the really heartwarming thing for me is the fact that there is a whole plethora of community activists who are using foresight techniques to create change. And that's actually what I think foresight is very often about, and the importance of it. So yes, I think that opening the conversations and enabling those voices to come to the fore is hugely important. And I think when it comes to the future of women, when you look at the SDG framework, the danger with how the Sustainable Development Goal framework has been applied is that it's still often anchored in 2015. So people are talking about a 2030 timeframe, but often reflecting the problems and the challenges of the past 5 years. And really what would be very valuable is that we take each of the goals and we kind of go, well, actually, what does that look like? If you start systematically looking out at the trends that are going to affect the opportunities as well as the downsides, actually, when you play some of the trends and disruptions out over 10 years. Now, I think it would be very, very valuable to do that exercise specifically on SDG 5, as you said, the one that's around women and girls, because there's all sorts of changes that are going to happen that policymakers could harness to improve the lot of women. So, for example, there's all sorts of as you mentioned, the future of tech and fourth industrial revolution, that's going to change the ability of women to participate in the workforce, to gain from their labor. And I think that there are some opportunities as well as risks that come from potentially growing inequalities that need to be factored into the decision-making process, which means that the shape of the problem and the opportunity out on a 2030 timeframe is actually quite different to the one here. But there's also going to be changes in values. I mean, we've seen the kind of shift in some of the alt-right movement. Now, if you play that together, you know, abortion, reproductive rights tends to be a kind of like a weaponized policy conversation. That's likely to just become greater over the next 10 years. And as technology develops and you actually start imaging what a fetus looks like in a womb, that's just going to throw fuel onto the fire of that debate, for example. So can we be prepared for those conversations? But there's also geopolitics. You know, how are some of the geopolitical shifts in the Middle East and in Central Asia going to play out in terms of the role of women in society and in the house? But, you know, that's even looking out 2030, which is relatively short time frame. If you start looking out 20 to 30 years, then there's going to be some really interesting developments around reproductive rights, around longevity. And then I think the whole balance between men and women over time towards the second half of the century is really going to start changing and being up for grabs. That's quite aside from the conversation about what the future of rights in itself looks like. So, you know, the rights as a framework, as a multilateral framework, is being really contested at the moment, whether it's gender, gay, ethnicity, and the framework to actually promote that in a multilateral framework. But at the same time, although it's massively under threat, there are some really interesting new conversations being had about a post-anthropomorphic set of rights. Like, what does it look like not to see humans as the center of the rights conversation, but actually humans within a nature and a natural setting where other kind of, well, whether it's lakes like in Latin America or oceans have got rights in themselves, let alone a conversation that we've been very much involved in, which is around intergenerational fairness. So how do you give rights to not just people who are alive and can advocate for themselves, but people who future and unborn generations? So that's a whole area of really interesting aspect. But like when you're also thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, and you're thinking about SDG 16, which is about accountable, inclusive, and effective institutions and the policy making processes for doing that, as well as SDG 17 around partnerships, you need processes through which communities can come together to create a desired vision of where they want to get to.
Yes.
You know, this is a deeply political act, and women, and we need spaces that are designed for effective deliberation and effective participation in which women are core to those conversations. And I'll just say one final thing there, which is, I think, why I think strategic foresight is so critical, both to exploring the future of women, exploring how we can kind of implement the Sustainable Development Goals in a way that is truly transformational and moves us away from business as usual. And that's the fact that foresight at its heart, and we can kind of come into discuss this in a second, it's about power, because it's understanding issues of distribution and access and voice and whose narrative, but it's also about love and bringing a lens and understanding of power and what it feels like to both exert it and to suffer from it, and bringing a perspective on how to integrate love and compassion into some of these kind of public discussions. I think that is deeply female and feminist in bringing those concepts into a kind of conversation about decision making and public policy, and this is why I think these conversations are so important.
Wow, you have really said a lot to unpack. I wish you had a whole day for a conversation. But I want to pick up on what you said about the last speech you said about bringing love into the conversation, especially in this very critical time in human history. When we're talking about, when I saw that book, Homo Deus, I was like, oh my God, this guy is so right. I've been saying it. We are becoming godlike in our powers to change our gender, to tweak the fetus in the womb and change a gene. I mean, we've just launched a space force and in America, and so I'm now thinking, oh my God, I think the Bible was right, because when they talk about chariots raining down fire from heaven, it's not chariots, it's the nuclear weapons. That's what they were talking about. Because if we ever unleash that, we're all toast. And so when you talk about love as a part of the conversation in the policy making, I'm wondering how one might, if one could enter that conversation through the lens of media and filmmaking in particular. Because obviously if we started talking about love and compassion as a construct, and so you're talking about the future of those who have not yet born, and it's the whole well-being movement that is really popping up, and I'm so excited. I tell everybody about what Wales has done, right? That Wales has a future well-being commission. I'm telling all islands, hoping that somebody will borrow from them and do it for the island of my own island of Jamaica, for example. But I think if we could sneak that in through film and find a way to tell the story of this new construction, because most of the films we see that are set in the future are very dark and dystopian. There's no what I call normatopian future. And I'm using the word normative because no word really exists for what it is I'm trying to describe. I mean, utopia is not what is we're going to arrive at. We're, after all, human, and therefore, there's certain conditions that will last probably till the end of time. But is there a way in which the abundance movement and the people who are pushing this idea of the donut economics, is there a way in which filmmaking can move beyond the wall of dystopian futures as a presentation of what we have to fight against, or there's always a hero fighting to survive, to a hero that's trying to kind of survive in this lens, with this lens of a more normative future in 2050, for example, when we're all using as the tipping date for the climate change conversation. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think filmmaking and storytelling and bringing story to life is a very, very powerful method, and has huge amounts to contribute to exploring the future. I mean, the question around why is it that so many films are dystopic about their view of the future, I mean, you can have a lot of hypotheses around that, but it does seem as if people, well, perhaps gloom sells, perhaps we feel powerless in a world of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps I would say there haven't been enough spaces where we can come together to constructively create the narrative and the dialogue of what that positive future looks like. So we're operating quite atomized, with anomie, I guess, if you like, and feel quite helpless in front of a future that feels so overwhelmingly and potentially dark. I mean, that could be why, but all I know is that the process of telling positive stories about communities collectively coming together and understanding how their future may be shaped, but still telling a constructive story about a desirable future and how they can get there. Is that important? Oh my God, that is incredibly important. And I do think it's very interesting that the public policy innovations in this space have been led by women. So yes, Sophie Howe is the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, and it was Jane Davidson who is the midwife, if you like, of as the Minister for the Environment in Wales in 2010. She was the one that actually came up with the legislation, and she's actually about to launch her book about this in Hay on Wye on the 31st of May. She's an incredibly amazing woman. But then you've also got the trio of women who have small nation leaders who have come together to talk about well-being, and that's Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, and also the Premier of Iceland. So I think there is something really interesting and very powerful. I mean, again, look at Costa Rica. Look at Rebecca Greenspan's work as vice president of that country. There's just something very interesting about bringing people together to tell a positive story about our collective futures in an uncertain world, and then representing that at scale and inspiring people. I think the role of film in that is very, very powerful indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the scenario of seeing these women in Finland and Iceland and New Zealand, that young, holding that level of power, and yes, they're small nations, but I really think that visual has really given a lot of people pause in other countries around the world. And in speaking about the futures of women here in the United States of America, we are wondering. I had a conversation with a gentleman yesterday, and he was like, he doesn't understand why we're so backward in that, all these other countries have a female president or prime minister. We can't get there. So, as we think about thrival and construction of the future, do you think that now we have this increasing density of women, women owning their own radio stations and television channels like Oprah, and women as premiers and prime ministers? Do you think we're approaching a tipping point then where we can see the narrative? If you talk about aspiration, not necessarily for 2030, but the young people that you're grooming, for example, 20 years from now, there will be 50, they will be in senior positions because they have been groomed at this early age to think about these things. Do you think that we're approaching that point for social change where we're having a 10% now having that same worldview that allows them to reach a tipping point?
So I'd return back to the two words, power and love. And I should actually probably mention that these aren't my terms when it comes to the importance of their application to foresight. That's obviously Adam Kahane wrote a wonderful, magnificent book a few years ago about this very topic. So the answer to your question is it really depends, because there are huge amounts of forces and drivers that could potentially drive huge amounts of inequality. Mm-hmm. And through that inequality, both create and break down linkages between people, and create the likelihood that people are atomized and in their communities and looking out for themselves, and prioritize, even though I'm a woman, I have less connection to a woman in another situation than I have to my own tribe. It breaks down connections, and therefore it kind of breaks down the love bit. It undermines the social contract. And so, all things being equal, I would absolutely see a tipping point where hopefully a more human approach to policy making is achieved. And I think women have a huge role to play in that. But I also see there's a lot of dark forces that could make that very, very difficult to kind of come together to collectively address some of the problems. We've got a window of opportunity in the next 10 to 15 years. And if we don't, then the forces driving us apart are likely to succeed. No amount of female emancipation is going to overcome that.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be instrumental? I mean, you have been a leader so far in actually making change. Your organization certainly has reached, I would think, in several, let's say, corridors of power. And so knowing that and being, I would say, a foresight leader, couldn't it be one of the things that we do as a result of even this conversation is convene a group of women, which include the women that have done the Wellbeing Act and the woman at the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and bring them together with some other women in technology, women in the media, to have a conversation where we look at, as what we say, some of the potential dark forces that could come, and begin to strategize around those challenges, so that we use foresight itself to help us organize to ensure that we have a better chance of surviving that pushback when it does happen.
Yep.
What can we learn from what has happened in the past to probably create and inform this idea and this future?
So I would say that, like, I would really agree with you, Claire. I think convening it around the UN SDG 5 and bringing a series of women together to talk about that, and then using that as a springboard for additional conversations, I think would be very, very interesting. I think there's also something, so within the NGFP, the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners group that we've got, many futurists say that there is something around, we should have a conversation around emerging feminist futures, which is about being more explicit about the role of foresight, not to explore the future as an object, as a ball out there that we're going to analyze and look through a kind of magnifying glass at to get as much evidence on, but actually to see the endeavor of foresight as a mirror, where what we're doing is we're hoping to speak truth to power, to bring more people to be able to reflect and understand ourselves as who we really are in a much more profound and deeper way, to enable us to transform and be prepared for the future. And I think that is what a feminist approach to foresight is about. It's very much about tapping there into that quality and potential for foresight. And so I would really love to have a deeper conversation about that. I think that's extremely important indeed.
Yeah. Do you, if we're to pick one of the challenges, let's say it's blockchain or artificial intelligence, or, you know, if you had to pick one as a focal point for a conversation around a potential challenge to this forward movement, which one would you pick and why?
Well, probably, I would probably choose not an emerging technology, because that's quite instrumentalist, and it yet again fits in with the whole kind of futures as technology, disruptive technology, which I think is part of the problem because it divides you into techno-optimists and techno-pessimists. But I'd take an area which is really important, like food security. Mm-hmm. So food security has got lots of different ways it can play out. Obviously, it's hugely important, especially across the African continent. It's extremely important because actually women spend most of their labor in most parts of the world trying to guarantee food security for their children. They're the ones that suffer if their families are food insecure. And yet the potential in terms of a changing sustainable development goals that are coming from all these amazing new innovations in the food value chain and from synthetic biology, and are really remarkable in terms of, but this is exactly the kind of thing that, like, all these innovations, if they're in multinational corporations or done at national policy making, or there's kind of health standards being set at a regional level, unless you have women in the room helping explore and explain what their lived reality is like and how certain changes and new regulations around emerging technology in this way, or like designing a value chain or redesigning logistics chain in that way, like, for, their views and their perspectives are not taken into account. So that's probably what I would do, just in order to kind of bring that to life a little bit more tangibly, if that helps.
Yeah, well, that does help, because I mean, one of the things we really want to do with this conversation is to have a conversation about the future of women. I think the way it's been done now in the traditional Women's History Month, International Women's Day, is very, okay, it's very like a superficial conversation. I think we need to go a little bit deeper and look at the changes we say we want to make according to these grand global goals, and really look at the driving forces and other things on the, as you say, on the optimistic side or on the challenging side that might prevent us from creating these optimistic futures. As we draw to a close, I have two questions. First is, we need to be more intentional, as you've been saying, about the story, about what we're creating now. We need to be bold about creating the story. And so I am a storyteller. I like to make up stories. Can you share with me a headline story that you would see or would like to see in 2030 based on, either what you're working on now or based on what you know is happening now?
So something like the government in Portugal stops a big infrastructure project from happening because of, actually no, I'll probably have to think about that. Yeah.
But what about one which spreads the gospel of well-being commissioners? I like.
Oh well, yeah, no, well, that's certainly, yeah. I mean, okay, here's one. I'm still very excited about the work that we're doing on intergenerational fairness in Portugal, which I actually think it's going to take time to change government's behaviour, and I think that what we're doing there is actually very likely to kind of change people's behaviour. What I would love to see is a headline where the Robin Hood futurists of 2020 become, the sheriffs of the future of like 2030. They're the ones that are then, inspiring decision making. So yeah, I mean, this is what I'm finding. It's like the kind of people that they're the Robin Hoods. They're kind of doing guerrilla tactics, if you like. They're working during the day, but they're in their spare time, they're doing amazing work in their communities. I would love that to kind of be part of a story where people are kind of glorifying and supporting the work that they do.
I think I like the Robin Hood futurists. I'm probably one of them. Robin Hood futurists.
Yeah, I mean, there you are.
I like that because I'm certainly doing guerrilla. Trying to change things in my little corner. And these days I'm talking about it, not just from the Caribbean perspective, but I'm talking about small island developing states, which is like 55 of us. So are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic about some of these things that we've been talking about coming to pass and moving us towards a more flourishing future?
So I'm optimistic. I am very, very optimistic in the power of the average person in the street to care about the person who's next to them and their future, if a deliberative process and conversation is held, and if you hear, if the stories are humanized. At the moment we're having a conversation in the UK about deporting foreign nationals after having served a crime of 12 months. And if you have the initial conversation, people are like, yeah, deport everyone. As soon as you humanize the conversation and you hear the stories of the individuals, it's a father, it's a daughter that's now living without her father, etc., then people become very, very different and much more nuanced. So there are lots of driving forces against deliberation, but there are also ways in which to support deliberation. And that's what makes me very optimistic, although I don't underestimate the challenges ahead.
Well, thank you so much. We have come to the end of another conversation. Thank you so much, Kat Tully, founder of School of International Futures. I'm so happy you could spend this time with me. Thank you.
Well, Claire, let me just say thank you again. It was an absolute pleasure, and I have huge respect and admiration for the work that you do. So thanks to you for inviting me and for all the work that you do. It's great.
Thank you. So that's it, folks. Thank you for joining us on the Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. We have come to the end of this great conversation, but the story continues being written by all of us. Creating the future we want is indeed our shared responsibility. Remember, it is better for us to act as the parent of our future than the child of our past. So seize the day, and as we say in Jamaica, walk good, safe journey.
Thank you for listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson. Future Sense Now is produced by the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Remember, our futures are embedded in the landscape of our present stories. Seize the day, share this story, and share the future.